All right, everybody, I think we're rolling. Okay, everybody. Hi. Today is the 22nd of January, 2020. Second session in our Pirkei Avot year, I don't know, 12, 13. Something like that. Something like that. I've been teaching this since I was 7. Okay. I want to in part pick up where we left off last time from the chart. Just so that you can get a sense of the history, and we are going to study the text today. But just by way of background, I wanted to give you a little bit of background, and I want to start right in the middle where it says Greece, the middle section of the control over the land of Israel timeline, because the fact that Greek influence starts at the same time as Jewish self-government, which is the Knesset Hagadol, which means the Great Assembly, which was the Sanhedrin, a center of Jewish learning, that the Greek, that is also during the period of Hellenism, is very historically important, as you're going to see in our class today. And then, of course, as you're moving to the right, the Greek influence got to the point where it seemed like there was either, depending on your perspective, either a tremendous amount of assimilation or forced conversion by the Greeks over the indigenous Jewish population that led to the revolt of the Hasmoneans and the Hanukkah story. So it depends on your perspective. Probably economically, the Jewish people welcomed the Greeks and wanted to be involved in their world in the same way that most Jewish people today, like what the secular world has to offer, want to be a part of it. And part of that was converting to Greek culture, adopting Greek names, Greek practice, and ultimately then Greek religion. So the idea that the Greeks came in and through massive persecution tried to eliminate Judaism is the Jewish perspective often, but may not be entirely historically accurate. You can well understand how it was a balance of both, but you can also understand how the people who wanted to maintain Judaism saw it as a military encroachment on Judaism and fought back in military ways. Anyhow, so that's the Hasmoneans. Then, underneath the Hasmonean, you get to the Zugot. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about Zugot here because primarily they're in the earlier chapters of Pirkei Avot, which tends to be chronological. The word Zugot, as I mentioned last time, means pairs. And these pairs are like Hillel and Shammai. And they're not rabbis. They're schooled in Jewish learning, meaning the oral interpretation of the Torah. But as the temple is still standing, there isn't really what we can call Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism doesn't happen until after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. That happens at the hands of the Romans, as you can see, the Roman Empire, above the word Zugot. And then just to the right of that is the word Tanaim. Tanaim means teachers, or more accurately, repeaters. It was an oral tradition of interpreting the Torah that began to coalesce around a certain group of teachers in schools in ways that we can discuss at some other time, and we will discuss in great detail, Brad, by the way, in the Live and Learn that I'm going to be doing. How that came to be, we're going to spend a lot of time in Live and Learn. But the Tanaim were repeaters, teachers during the period of the Mishnah, which was the first compendium of Jewish law, edited around the year 200. As you move further to the right, the Amoraim were the authors of the Gemara. Mishnah plus Gemara equals Talmud. They were the ones who began to write down the oral traditions as handed down to them by the Tanaim. So the Tanaim and the Amoraim are the authors of the Talmud. The Talmud, basically from 200 of the Common Era through to the end of the 500. And then as you move further on to the right, it gets a little fuzzy in terms of our Jewish knowledge, historical knowledge. The Savuraim were the editors of the Talmud. And as it is with most literature, and Jewish literature is no exception, you don't usually learn a lot about the editors. Editors work behind the scenes by definition, so we don't really know a whole ton about them, but that's how the Talmud, as we know it, came into being. And so it's that period, the Tanaim Amoraim, that we're going to be studying historically when we are in Pirkei Avot. Questions? So Pirkei Avot literally means the chapters. Parak is a chapter, Pirkei, plural, prakim. And Avot literally means the fathers. That's why sometimes it's called the wisdom of the fathers or ethics of the fathers. But in this sense, Avot means the elders, or it can also mean principles. It doesn't necessarily mean a person. It could be just the principles. An Av can be a principle. So it's a chapters of principles, not necessarily about the authors so much as it is about the content. Okay. It is a section of the Talmud, I think I mentioned this last time, that is devoid of any Jewish law. You're not going to learn how to do Shabbos. You're not going to learn how to shake a lulav. But you're going to learn how to live a good life. And that those ethical teachings, as we're going to see in just a moment, come from the method of learning and scholarship that Jewish people modeled after the Greeks. That idea of the academy, where scholarly people sat together and discussed high-minded topics, was what was going on in Greece, and modeled by Jewish people in Israel. Very effective way of learning. Okay, so the last piece before we get into text that I wanted to get into is that by way of preamble, I want to look at the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Now we studied this probably back in 1957 as a class, but it really goes a long way to understanding the way the rabbis saw themselves and their authority to take over the leadership of Jewish life once the temple was destroyed. That's where Rabbinic Judaism really starts. The temple is destroyed. Jewish leadership to this point had been the functionaries of the temple, the Kohanim and the Leviim, and their power base is entirely wiped out by the destruction of the temple. And into that vortex gets sucked in all the Jewish people in the whole Mediterranean basin, and from it emerges a new type of leadership which is not connected to the temple, and that's when the first rabbis are ordained. It's not to say that those scholars weren't in existence in the time of the Zugot. They didn't have the title. Because the highest title you could have was Kohen and Levi, which of course you only got by lineage, by virtue of your birth, as opposed to rabbi. As you can see, any idiot can become a rabbi. So, but on the other hand, as we're going to see today, it made for a much, much more vibrant expression of Jewish life, and it's the one that we live today, in 2020, from the year 70, direct line of the way Jewish community and Jewish leadership and Jewish learning have all been structured. So I last week I had printed this out, and I didn't know if the textbooks were going to come in. So if you want to look at your own textbook, you can. If you want to just follow it on the sheet, it's pretty. I copied it word for word, so you don't really. But if you want to feel like you're getting your money's worth out of your book, or you want to look at the Hebrew, it's page 1, chapter 1, page 1, and the nomenclature 1:1. It means chapter 1, Mishnah 1.
Yeah. You went over the timeline. I forget. Where's and when was it that the Torah that we know now was like consolidated?
Okay. So
that's right after the Second Temple.
No, it's well before. No, it's well before. If we go by the by Jewish tradition itself, it would be somewhere. Moses lived somewhere around 1250 before the Common Era. The Exodus was somewhere about 1250 before the Common Era, which would put that 1,300 years before the destruction of the second. Now, first temple destroyed 586 before the Common Era, so it's 700 years before that, somewhere around there. Modern scholars, using literary analysis and historical analysis, seem to think that the Torah that we have now is probably from the Babylonian exile, which happened post 586 before the Common Era. So if you're looking at it on the chart, it would be right where the Persian period begins. You see, in terms of to the left of Greece. So the Torah itself purports to be Egypt and Canaanites. That would be the Torah itself, historically. Then judges, kings, and prophets, all the way up to about past the 500 before the Common Era, the negative 500 side. That's all the biblical period, post-Torah, but still biblical. Prophets and writings are two other sections of the Hebrew Bible. And scholars today, for various reasons, and the argument is rather compelling, there's some really wonderful books about this, seem to believe that it was in the exile that the 5 books were edited into its current version. But if you go by the Torah itself, about 1250 before the Common Era. So the temple was destroyed in 586. Jewish people exiled for about 50 years to Babylonia, 70 years, something like that. They were allowed to go back. The vast majority of people stayed in Persia during the Babylonian period, and it's believed that that was the time in exile that the Torah reached it's close to its final edit now. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and then this was 1,000 years.
And then and then so from that period on, after the Jews come back, just very briefly, the Jewish people come back. They're largely uneducated. They're immigrants. They're like Australians of their day, left and did their thing. Not that Australians are uneducated, but that's how the colony started. Anyhow, the public reading of the Torah was introduced by Ezra, who has a book of the Bible named after him in the writings, and that gave access to everybody to the Torah, from which an oral tradition arose of interpretation once the Torah was being read in public. Just like I give a sermon on Shabbos, they would give a sermon on Shabbos or weekdays. Those schools of thought coalesced ultimately around some rabbinic authorities who became these zugot. And that oral tradition was passed after the destruction of the temple via the Tanaim, these repeaters, and it's during that Tanaim period that Pirkei Avot comes from. And it's an exception to the rule because most of what rabbinic wisdom and teaching at that time was about was how to structure a new non-temple based Judaism. So it's a lot of ritual stuff. They have to invent a whole new system of ritual because the temple is destroyed. And so, but this is sui generis in that it doesn't talk about ritual. And that probably also contributes to its popularity because it's not minutia. It's not dry. It's pithy and easy to read, and the custom arose to read this on Shabbos afternoons between Mincha and Mariv and study this, and it appears in almost every Siddur. So even our Siddur has, our Shabbos Siddur has Pirkei Avot in it. So if you ever board in services, flip to Pirkei Avot. There's plenty of good stuff, and you will be in a long line of Jews historically who have been board in services and gone to Pirkei Avot. So I won't feel bad if you study Pirkei Avot and then look up and say, what did he say? Okay. Of course, the Chazan would be furious. Just kidding. She doesn't care either. Pay attention, don't pay. Just come. Okay. So does that sort of get you?
Yes, thank you.
Get you there? Okay. But look at this Mishnah, this first Mishnah, and you'll understand a little bit also, Brad. This will draw it into sharper relief here. So this is the way this non-code, but this code of conduct, I suppose, this sort of pithy teachings sees itself. And this is the way Pirkei Avot begins. At Sinai, Moses received, and I put the word "the" in brackets because in Hebrew it says Moshe Kibel Torah. It does not say Moshe Kibel Ha-Torah, which would mean the Torah. He received Torah, which in the larger definition means teaching. He received some teaching, which is what I believe. That a historical figure named Moses had some encounter with God at a physical place called Sinai. What that Torah looks like that we have today isn't necessarily Moses, the divine stenographer, writing down exactly what God said, but is in fact the oral tradition that arose, and some of it was written, some of it was, I don't know which was which, and scholars have spent their entire careers trying to figure out which parts go back furthest, etc. But so Moses received Torah, and he handed it over to Joshua. Joshua is Moses' second in command, who's appointed in the Torah itself, but when Moses dies, he takes over, and the book of Joshua picks up exactly where the Torah left off. Moses dies, the next day, the book of Joshua begins, and that's why on Simchat Torah, when we finish reading the Torah, on Simchas Torah, the Haftorah is the first chapter of Joshua. We just pick up right where Torah left off. So Moses hands this Torah over to Joshua, who hands it over to the elders, who handed it over to the prophets, who in turn handed over to I guess I typed that twice. Over to the prophets, who handed over to the men of the great assembly, Knesset Hagadolah, on your chart there. Okay, you can see them to the right of the prophets on your time chart. And from the men of the great assembly, then as you shift to the right, then comes the Zugot, then comes the Tanaim, then comes the Amoraim. So in the Tanaitic period, the sages are saying, we have this direct line back to Moses. We are the legitimate inheritors of what happened at Sinai. Is a direct line. And they have to do that because otherwise they have no legitimacy. They're basically making this whole thing up. They're not. If you want to say who are the leaders according to the Torah, the Kohanim and Levine. Well, there aren't any more Kohanim and Levine. So who's going to take charge? What's going to happen? So this rabbinic period begins, and the first thing that the rabbis have to do is establish their authority. And their authority is, okay, this goes all the way back. So then they have to have an interesting, so then you say, well, if it goes all the way back, why didn't the Torah mention you guys? Your rabbis. And that gave rise to the oral Torah. At Sinai, the rabbis say, conveniently, at Sinai, God gave two Torahs. He gave a written Torah that Moses wrote down, or I guess chiseled down, and also, when Moses had questions, God filled them in with an oral tradition that we've been handing down from generation to generation as a parallel. And we're in that parallel part. And we're that oral tradition. And the rabbis are the inheritors of the oral tradition. And that's the way they justify their authority, their being. Any questions on that? Understand where that's coming from? Yeah? Okay. So that's how the rabbis saw themselves and how they got to be these teachers. What likely happened, of course, over time was once the Torah was read in public, people began to discuss it. And once they began to discuss it, certain general trends of interpretation said, okay, this is okay, and this is outside of the norm. And that's always been that way. You know, it's like we can have Ashkenazim and Sephardim, and we can have Reform Conservative and Orthodox, but if you're a Jews for Jesus, you're outside. You got to draw the line somewhere. And so they kind of created a normative idea of Judaism. There were probably at that time lots of other competing ideas, but they won.
But before that, there was, I guess, strict law, right?
No, before that, it's kind of hard to say. So, there, in terms of what ritual life looked like, the best that we could say is that it was a close reading, a close approximation of what the Torah itself said. But the Torah, for instance, doesn't give you really a lot of details about keeping kosher. It tells you you can eat these birds and you can't eat these birds. It says you can't eat milk and meat, but it doesn't tell you if fish is meat. It doesn't tell you if chicken is meat. It doesn't tell you, the order, and all of these kinds of things. So once the Torah was read in public, people began to discuss that, and how they practiced probably was at some point fairly random, and then coalesced around certain central ideas that were promulgated by leading teachers, and they became schools of thought, like the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai, and that's how a more normative Judaism began. And then ultimately, because I want to be able to eat at your house and you want to eat at my house, and we both consider ourselves kosher, but we're doing something totally different, you had to have an even more normative, which became law with the Mishnah in 200 of the common year. So it's very much still until the rabbinic period, very much a matter of speculation of what Jewish ritual observance looked like, other than what's specifically stated in the Torah. And most of what was specifically stated in the Torah in terms of ritual life surrounded the temple, sacrifice, that sort of thing. Once that's gone, the whole book of Leviticus is all temple sacrifices. Literally rip the heart out. It's book number 3 out of 5. You just take that whole central piece out and gone. And so what the rabbis is fairly astounding. I mean, they were able to recreate Judaism. It's like it would make a great since everything is being made into a television series now because there's 7,000 networks. It would make a great series. Imagine what it would be like if all 3 branches of the government in the United States were wiped out and you had to start out fresh. Well, that's not so far-fetched. No, that's kind of what it was like. The base of what we know, as Judaism was essentially wiped out. So the rabbis have to say, we got this, and therefore they're authenticating themselves in the beginning of Pirkei Avot. Okay? So much for the historical background. Now, as promised, we're going to jump into one section of our text. And we are up to chapter 4. Now, chapter 4, Mishnah number 1. That's where we're starting. And this is a great one. Oh, this is an unbelievably beautiful news for Jews that you can use text. Okay. So we are on page 56. Now everybody should have a text. Page 56. Wow, we've made so much progress in 13 years. We're not going to make a lot more today. But I want to say that this is one of the most famous of all of the Mishnayot of Pirkei Avot is the one that we're going to be looking at for the next couple of weeks. Okay. If you look at on the top left, 4:1, meaning chapter 4 of Mishnah number 1, Ben Zoma said, "Who is wise? The one who learns from everyone, as it is said, from all who would teach me have I gained understanding. Who is mighty? One who controls one's natural urges, as it is said, one who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and one who rules one's spirit than one who conquers a city. Who is rich? One who is happy with what one has, as it is said, when you eat what your hands have provided, you shall be happy, and good will be yours. You shall be happy in this world, and good will be yours in the world to come. Who is honored? One who honors others, as it is said, those who honor me, says God, will I honor, and those who despise me, says God, will be lightly esteemed." That's it. Okay. Now, we're going. All right. There's a lot of meat on that bone. Right. Exactly. So we're gonna do it in bite-sized chunks, Cheryl. So don't worry. There's plenty to chew on, and we're gonna get right into it. Okay. So the first thing that I wanted to point out is I wanted to carry over the timeline to the Mishnah that we're learning. So first of all, Ben Zoma is a Tana, one of the Tanaim. So he's one of those early repeaters. Temple been destroyed. We're about 2 generations past that already. And his name is Ben Zoma. His first name is not Benjamin. It's Ben as in son of Zoma. And he's called Ben Zoma and not Rabbi Ben Zoma. And that's why I wanted to mention this. Hillel's not called Rabbi Hillel because there was no such thing as rabbis when he lived. Ben Zoma lived at a time when there were rabbis, but he was only called Ben Zoma. And the reason was, according to Rashi or some other commentary, because he died young before he was officially ordained, which is possible because you have to realize that it wasn't until the 19th century that there was such a thing as professional Jewish clergy. And we only started it because Christians were doing it. Prior to the 19th century, all rabbis had a real job. They didn't get paid for this kind of stuff. They did all kinds of different stuff. Rashi, the great rabbinic commentary, the most famous of all Torah and Talmud commentary, he lived in the 11th century. He was a wine merchant. Maimonides was a doctor. But they also had jobs like working in a tannery and being a sandal maker and tailor and all kinds of real jobs. So at a certain point, they reached a certain level of learning, and then they were ordained by a master or another rabbi, and so Ben Zoma was a very, very successful businessman according to the Talmud. He was a very, very wealthy individual, but he wasn't so far along in his studies to get ordination before he died. So that's why he's called Ben Zoma and not Rabbi Ben. And so he's not amongst the Zugot. He is from the Tanaim. Before we get into the specifics of this one, we're going to do the Who is Wise section today. This type of learning is called a paradox. What's a paradox? A paradox is the juxtaposition of a set of seemingly contradictory concepts that reveal a hidden or unexpected truth. The paradox may be hard or even impossible to believe, yet usually the contradiction can be reconciled if the reader thinks about the juxtaposition more deeply. That's what this text is designed to do, what we just read. The ancient Greeks we're well aware that a paradox can take us outside our usual way of thinking. They combine the prefix para, meaning beyond or outside of, like the paranormal, with the verb dokin, to think, forming paradoxus, an adjective meaning contrary to expectation. Latin speakers picked up the word and used it to create their noun paradoxum, which English speakers borrowed during the 1500s to create the word paradox. This is particularly important because it was in the Greek world that this was written. So they employed, the Jews, the rabbis, employed a method of learning that was familiar to the rest of the intellectual world. They didn't come up with this. I'm sure you are, well aware of what, a paradox is. Like, you have to spend money to make money. That's a paradox. There are seemingly contradictory, but upon further reflection, leads to greater depth of understanding by sort of twisting around in your mind. And what Ben Zoma is doing is he's talking about paradox as a way of illustrating wisdom, strength, wealth, and honor. And honestly, what else do you want in life? If strength and health are the same thing, that pretty much covers everything that a person would hope to attain in this world. And so Ben Zoma is, and I think that's why this Mishnah, by the way, comes at the beginning of a chapter, is sort of summarizing what we can aspire to in living good lives. The brilliant thing about this is that, remember that this is coming 40 years after the destruction of the temple. And the rabbis are reinventing Judaism. And they're saying connecting with God isn't going to be through this temple with sacrifice with these hereditary leaders. Connection with God is going to be through learning, prayer, and good behavior. Living the kind of life God wants us to lead is what will draw us closer to God. So therefore, developing our own sense of morality, right and wrong, ways that we treat other people, is divine service. The temple is destroyed. Prayer becomes the substitute for sacrifice. We give God our most precious thing, which is not our animals, but our time, through prayer. And study becomes the means both of connecting with God intellectually and refining our characters in such a way that draws us closer to living in the divine image. It's brilliant. It is absolutely brilliant. Totally reinvents a system that says, this I can use. I don't need more flations. I don't need somebody else who's invested with divine authority to run my life and tell me how to get close to God. I can do this on my own. If you think about marketing, if you think about branding, how brilliant was that? In the face of cataclysm comes this way of refining human character in a way that then gave birth to Christianity and Islam. If it wasn't for this, there wouldn't be that. That's what their systems are ultimately trying to do as well. Draw closer to God through proper behavior. Some of it ritualized, most of it leading to hopefully more ethical behavior. So he does this through paradox. So the first paradox deduces is, who is wise? The logical answer would be, what? Somebody who studies a lot. Exactly. What's another one? Who is wise?
Someone who's just smart.
Right, somebody who's just born smart. Exactly. Some people are just born smart. Absolutely. The paradox is, no, it's one who can learn from everyone. which seems a little ridiculous. Because if I were to say to you, you know, we're going to go out and find 5 random people on the street or in the hallway to teach this class, and I brought in the guy who's stringing those wires, right? And somebody else who's an ECC teacher, and somebody else, you know, who happens to be delivering from UPS, you would say, that's not the way it works. Who can learn from? Spend your time with smart people, and you'll learn. So the paradox is, clearly, that you can learn something from everyone. There are several ways that we can take this. First of all, just on the surface level. One, it means, to me, anybody want to offer an interpretation? What does it mean? From all who
Well, I don't think wise has to necessarily do with book smart
right,
or knowledge.
right, right,
You can be wise in so many areas.
Right.
And not necessarily intelligent.
right. So the first thing, right, beautiful point, Arlene. So the first point, the point that Arlene is making is that there's a difference between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge is something that you accrue from learning from text, and wisdom is the synthesis of what you learn and being able to integrate it into the world around you. Which, if you think about it, is exactly what the Judaism they're trying to invent is. Which is, it's not about learning the esoteric ways to slaughter an animal. It's about learning the ways of incorporating God's teaching into every aspect of our lives. And that's what wisdom is. So from the outset, the rabbis are kind of defining what wisdom is. And it's this cumulative effect of integrating everything that we know and learn with the world around us in an interactive, sort of symbiotic give and take with people around us, which is a pretty cool way of looking at the world. What does it say in terms of ego, this statement?
Well, you can't think you're better than anybody else because you might have more book knowledge.
Right, simply because you have more book knowledge, don't assume that that person has nothing to teach you.
Right, that's what, yeah, that was the rest of my, we get it out,
Yeah.
that's enough.
Yeah.
But I was thinking when you said ECC teacher, I mean, sometimes you can become so jaded by things that you might have learned book-wise, and then you see things through the eyes of a child, maybe snap yourself out of, maybe I need to look at this another way, something you might have learned, you know, to enhance your life and be able to relate it to
Absolutely,
others.
absolutely. Going back to my particular examples that I gave before, is the guy who's running those wires knows more about security in this building than I do.
Right.
And there's something to learn from him. The person who is the UPS driver knows this neighborhood a lot better, and I'm not talking just about deliveries. I'm talking about what neighborhoods are safe and what, you know, where,
Exactly.
where
So
there's something to be learned.
everybody has something to
Exactly.
learn.
So, right.
And you
But-
can't think you have all the answers.
Exactly. And so if you look at the parallel source that I brought at the bottom paragraph on Pirkei Avot from Barachot, which is another section of the Talmud that does deal with laws dealing with prayer, Rabbi Shmuel ben Nachmani said, "What is the meaning of that which is written, if you have been foolish in lifting up yourself, or if you have thought evil? Zamota, put your hand on your mouth." From the book of Proverbs, a kind of a confusing verse. Anyone who abases himself over matters of Torah, asking questions despite the shame he feels for his ignorance, will ultimately be exalted, and if he muzzles himself due to embarrassment, he will end up with his hand over his mouth, unable to answer. If you are above another person, if you're above other people, or you think your question will compromise that your image of your self-image in the eyes of another person, you're never going to learn. So what Ben Zoma is saying here essentially is on the most simple level, is that everybody you meet can teach you something. I remember when I was in Alabama, probably shared this story with some of you over the years, because it was very impactful in my life. So we had a guy who mowed the lawn named Sam, and he was illiterate. He signed his paychecks with an X. In Alabama, in the 1980s, I suspect there still are, but a good number of people in their upper years who didn't have the benefit of schooling. Anyhow, so the president of the synagogue, he had been using a tractor with a pole mower behind it, and it broke. So the president went to Sears and bought a riding mower with a manual that was thicker than this. And we were like, plotting, what are you gonna, can't.
There's no YouTube video.
Right, there's no YouTube, and Sam can't read the book. So we worked up the courage to finally show him the new machine. And we go over and we give him the keys, and we said, this is for you. Do you think you're going to be able to handle? He was in his 60s and been working in the fields his whole life. And he just looked at us and he said, "It's a mower, ain't it?" And he got on, turned it, and drove away. And from that I learned, you know what you know. And then this, and I learned a lot from watching Sam. It's a mower, ain't it? There's so many things in life like that that are just,
Common sense.
just do it. Yeah. I know how to do this, right? I've been doing it my whole life. Anyhow, so I think part of it is that you can't minimize your expectations from learning from other people. You should not put your ego up so high that you can't be open to learning from everyone. It goes beyond that to also to say that a thirst for knowledge, a thirst for learning, a thirst for wisdom can take you in a million different directions. And the opportunities for wisdom are all around you all the time if you seek them out, if you're open to those kinds of learning experiences. It's not a matter of memorizing dry facts. Wisdom is incorporating what you know and the way you understand the world with other ways of understanding it so that you grow in your depth of perception of the world around you. It also says that we need to recognize that from the standpoint of Jewish learning, every single person has something unique to add, no matter where they are and where they come from. So, in a certain sense, everyone carries Torah in the sense of teaching with them. And it doesn't necessarily only mean people who had a lot of textual knowledge. When you look at what makes, for instance, a congregation great, it's people who bring all kinds of different experiences from all kinds of different worlds, personal and professional. And together we make something that's far greater than the sum of its individual parts. That's the way wisdom is accrued by community, by recognizing that every person who comes from a different perspective carries their own Torah and contributes to the larger Torah that makes us who we are. And if you're thinking about that historically, that democratization of Jewish learning takes the Jewish wisdom out of the hands of the guys who are working in a temple and puts it in you and me and my kids and anybody else who's willing to apply themselves to the enterprise of doing Judaism. And that's ties into what we were talking about last time, which is that we write Jewish history. The way we live our lives sets the course of Jewish history for generations to come. So, so I think that it has nothing to do, obviously, what he's doing is it's not rank, it's not based on position, it's not based on economics. It's based on wisdom, learning, interaction with the world around you. Interestingly, one of he quotes, Ben Zoma quotes a source. Who is wise? The one who learns from everyone. As it is said, from all who would teach me have I gained understanding. Why does he quote from the Bible? To authenticate the teaching. Remember the first Mishnah. This is what the book of Psalms meant when it said this. So we're interpreting the Bible, which takes us back to the source. And therefore, we can justify our interpretation because we're linking it on something that everybody accepts as a sacred text, even though they're inventing the oral Torah stuff kind of as they go along. So it's brilliant in that it anchors it in history, anchors it with spiritual authority, but it also serves as a way of teaching people Bible. You learned this verse because you learned this teaching. I learned from everyone. Oh, and it says in the book of Psalms something very similar. One of the important things, though, when you're studying, I learned this very early in rabbinical school, is that whenever a rabbinic text gives you a verse from the Bible, you got to look it up. Because just because they say it means that doesn't necessarily mean that. And in fact, when I was doing my homework for this, that section of Psalms means just the opposite of what Ben Zoma was saying. Look at the source. So just what are Psalms, just in general? The book of Psalms, in Hebrew Tehillim, praises commonly referred to as the Psalms or Psalter, is the first book of Ketuvim, the third part of the Hebrew Bible. The title is derived from the Greek psalmoi, again, Greek instrument meaning instrumental music, and by extension, words accompanying the music. The book is an anthology of 150 individual psalms. It's in the third section, as we talked about. Many are linked to the name of David. In other words, it says a Psalm of David. But his unique authorship is not accepted by modern scholars, or really much anybody, because some of the Psalms are like by the rivers of Babylon, which happened hundreds of years after King David died. But Psalm 119, which Ben Zoma is quoting, which he is saying teaches us that we can learn something from everybody we meet, actually reads, and I give it in context here, starting with 97, "Oh, how I love your law," meaning God. "I meditate it all day long. Your commandments are always with me and make me wiser than my enemies. I have more insight than all my teachers, for I meditate on your statutes. I have more understanding than the elders, for I obey your precepts." This is just the opposite of what he was intending to teach. But it shows you the rabbinic authority to be able to reinterpret the text in a way that fits their objective, which is getting to the point that you can learn something from everyone. So that's just by way of saying, always check your sources. Don't take it necessarily at face value. One of the things that I also just did want to mention about Ben Zoma's teaching here is that at a certain level, unlike the priests, unlike the Kohanim, he is giving away his authority. By saying you can learn something from everyone, one, I believe illogical, but logical extension of that is, why do I need you? If I can learn from everyone, why do I need you? Why do I need teachers? And one of the brilliant things about the rabbis was that the goal that they established early on, that we live with to this day, is to empower as many Jews to gain as much insight into living a good Jewish life as possible, which was uncommon in most of early history. Most of the time, wisdom and spiritual leadership were highly guarded by an elite. And what this does is it democratizes Jewish learning, even at the expense of the rabbis themselves. So my goal, like Rabbi Green's goal in doing Torah talk, my goal in teaching you and teaching our kids, is that every single person is an interpreter of Torah and has the validity to do so. It's a fantastic way of organizing humanity, and particularly creating a spiritual system. It's brilliant, brilliant. And so time and again, they go after sources that would parallel that. And I'm gonna begin the next time with just a couple of parallels from other sections of Pirkei Avot. But I want to close with the relevant quotes on the back of the page, because I think that these are sort of modern applications of from who is wise, the one who learns from everyone. These are just a few that I liked. Churchill said, I'm always ready to learn, although I do not always like being taught. Which means that, which I take to mean that it does take a certain amount of humility to be willing to learn from everybody. Wisdom is not a product of schooling, but the lifelong attempt to acquire it. Anyone who stops learning is old, whether 20 or 80. Anyone who keeps learning stays young. And finally, learning is not attained by chance. It must be sought for with ardor and attended with diligence. That's what the rabbis were saying. From now on, Jewish learning is going to be of paramount importance, and the ritual aspects will be yet another means to the end. The end is connecting with God in such a way that it influences our lives and God's world for the better. And there are different paths up the mountain. Some are through learning, some are through ritual behavior, but all paths are open to everyone. So in a certain sense, the destruction of the temple was one of the greatest things that ever happened to Judaism, because it democratized Jewish learning, it empowered every single individual, it created a spiritual system where the goal of the leadership is to be insignificant so as to empower everybody else. One of the mistakes that we make in Jewish life today is that we put too much power and too much authority in the clergy, too much of leaning on them, us, to be ritual Jewish life facilitators. The system is designed, everybody empowered. And that's really what the goal is. That's the spiritual tradition that we have inherited. The last thing I want to say is, if you want to understand why Jews have been so successful in the world, why we're still around, why we're so vastly overrepresented in just about by any measure of leadership, it all comes back to this. It all comes back to the idea that every single person with a brain has the potential to lift themselves up and to be a leader in whatever world it is that they want to function in. And that the goal is to empower, not to minimize learning and leadership. That's who we are, and it comes, from this. Yeah.
One comment. In the first part when you were reading about how it was handed down, I like the way they use fence and not wall.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, I wasn't sure if you were going to touch that at all, but the idea of a fence, when you have a fence around something, if you think of like
yes.
a rancher, like people put things they want to grow and nurture in a fence, not a wall. And
Right.
the idea that a fence, people can get through a fence,
It's a good one.
and the idea that it should be something that's accessible and reachable.
Right.
It grows, not something that's protected and,
Right. Right.
sheltered.
He's absolutely reiterates that. You're 100% right. In Jewish parlance, making a fence around the Torah also implies not making a buffer between right and wrong. To be able to know that, as you said, there's a way into it that's not exactly 100% black and white. So like, for instance, lighting Shabbos candles 18 minutes early is a fence around the Torah. Why not just simply say candle lighting is at 5:20, because that's exactly when sunset is, instead of saying that it's at 5:02, when you know the sunset's not going down until 5:20. And the fence is because you can be 15 minutes late and still be 3 minutes early. So that's similarly a way of getting to it without necessarily being blocked from it. Very good. All right, we will pick up next time a little bit more on this first shtickle of Ben Zoma, and then continue on with the rest of his paradoxes.
Zoma was a merchant, you said? Yeah. Did they know more about it? Like his lineage, do they know?
I didn't.